Guadalcanal, 1942. A Marine private is flat on his stomach in the mud outside the perimeter, close enough to hear a Japanese soldier moving through the brush ahead of him in the dark. He has a rifle slung across his back. He does not reach for it. He reaches instead for the knife on his belt, a 7-inch blade with a stacked leather handle that fits his palm like it was built for exactly this moment. Because it was. He does not know the knife's own official designation. Nobody does. By the time he is holding it, every Marine in the Pacific has already started calling it by one simple name, stamped right into the steel by a company that never set out to design a legend. Why would the Marine Corps spend the first year of a world war fighting with knives improvised from civilian hunting patterns before finally settling on one design? Why did that same design replace a specialized commando dagger the Marine Raiders had already been issued and in some cases actually preferred for exactly the job it was built to do? And how did a blade named after nothing more than a manufacturer's own logo become the single most recognizable edged weapon in American military history? Marines are still issued today, 83 years after a rushed wartime contract first put it into production. The knife that would eventually be called the Ka-bar did not begin as anyone's grand design. It began as a documented complaint working its way up through the ranks. American troops shipping out to both the European and Pacific theaters in the earliest months of the war had already started bringing their own personal hunting knives from home, a quiet but widespread signal that the standard issue blades the military was actually handing out struck a lot of soldiers as genuinely inadequate for real combat use, rather than the kind of hypothetical field problem a quartermaster could safely ignore. Marine Corps Colonel John M. Davis and Major Howard E. America took that signal seriously enough to design a new fighting and utility knife largely around an existing commercial pattern already trusted by American outdoorsmen, the Western L-77 hunting knife, reworked and reinforced into something that could survive the specific abuse of a Pacific jungle campaign rather than a weekend in the woods back home. The knife was never conceived from a blank sheet of paper. It was conceived from a hunting knife that already worked, made tougher. The Marine Corps officially approved the design on November the 23rd, 1942, under the considerably less memorable designation M1219C2, a bureaucratic label that would not survive contact with the men actually carrying the weapon into combat. The first shipment reached Marines from Camillus Cutlery Company on January the 27th, 1943, barely 2 months later, an unusually fast turnaround for a design that would go on to outlive nearly every other piece of individual combat equipment issued that same year across the entire war effort. The knife proved popular enough that the Navy adopted the identical basic pattern as its own diving and utility blade almost immediately afterward, a bit of inter-service overlap that actually created a genuine naming headache nobody had fully anticipated. To keep the two branches straight, the Marine Corps renamed its own version the USMC Mark II Combat Knife, a formal designation almost nobody who actually carried the weapon ever used in ordinary conversation. Before we get into exactly why that formal name never stuck, and the specialized commando dagger this knife eventually replaced, if you're finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. The name that did stick came from nowhere more official than a stamp on the steel itself. Union Cutlery Company, one of several manufacturers actually producing the knife under wartime contract, stamped its own examples with bold lettering reading Ka-bar directly on the flat of the blade near the handle. A straightforward manufacturer's mark, never intended to become anything more than that. Marines noticed. By 1944, the nickname had spread so completely that soldiers were calling every version of the knife a Ka-bar, regardless of which company had actually made the specific one in their own hand, a manufacturer's own logo, effectively renaming an entire branch of military equipment through nothing more than word of mouth repeated across an entire theater of war stretching thousands of miles. The nickname proved so durable that in 1952, Union Cutlery formally changed its own name to Ka-bar Cutlery, adopting the label the Marines themselves had already given the product a decade earlier rather than the other way around. That title, The Silent Killer, deserves a closer look before we go any further. because it complicates rather than confirms exactly what actually made this knife successful in the field. Marine Raiders, an elite formation trained specifically for close-quarters night operations, were originally issued a completely different blade, the Raider Stiletto, a design built for one purpose alone: a fast, silent kill at close range, and nothing else. It excelled at exactly that single task. It was nearly useless for anything else a deployed Marine actually needed a knife for on an ordinary day. Opening ration tins, cutting rope, clearing brush, the unglamorous work that made up the overwhelming majority of any blade's real combat deployment, regardless of how dramatic its own original design brief had actually been. By late 1943, the Marine Corps had already replaced the stiletto with the Mark II, specifically because raiders themselves found the more versatile design considerably more useful in practice, even though it sacrificed some of the stiletto's own specialized silent killing edge to gain that broader everyday usefulness. The knife history now nicknames the Silent Killer was, if anything, the working replacement for the actual silent killer the Corps had already tried and quietly moved past once real field use exposed exactly what that specialization had cost them. By the war's own end, the knife had been issued to nearly every Marine who wanted one. Camillus Cutlery alone manufactured more than 1 million examples before the fighting stopped. The number is worth sitting with on its own. More than 1 million knives from a single manufacturer for a design that started as a 2-month rush job to fix a complaint nobody had originally planned to solve with a formal weapons program at all. Manufacturing across the war years was never perfectly consistent either, and that inconsistency is itself part of the record, rather than a footnote to skip past on the way to the next battle. Early production blades used a pommel attachment method that proved prone to loosening under hard use in the field, exactly the kind of failure a Marine could not afford to discover mid-fight, and the method for securing the pommel to the tang went through several genuine revisions between 1942 and 1945 as returning feedback from actual combat made clear exactly where the design still needed work. None of those changes were cosmetic. Each one reflects a weapon being adjusted in real time by the men actually depending on it to hold together when it mattered most. A design that never stopped being edited by the people using it, even after it had already reached full wartime production. The blade itself was built around a specific, teachable shape rather than any single dramatic feature. 7 inches of high-carbon steel, finished into a clip-point profile capable of both a controlled thrust and a genuine slashing cut, a compromise most specialized fighting knives of the era deliberately avoided in favor of committing fully to one style of attack or the other. The handle, 22 stacked leather discs, compressed under extreme pressure and cut with grooves for grip, was chosen specifically because it held firm even soaked through with rain, sweat, or worse conditions. A Pacific jungle campaign guaranteed on virtually every single patrol. A Marine could learn to grip it, orient it, and use it effectively in a matter of minutes, and that same simplicity is precisely why the knife survived so many separate wars, carried by so many separate generations of Marines who never received anything resembling extensive, specialized blade training beyond the basics. The knife's own reputation hardened into legend across the Pacific Island campaigns that defined the Pacific War's own most brutal fighting. On Iwo Jima in early 1945, Marines cleared Japanese defensive positions built into volcanic rock and connected by tunnels no rifle could effectively reach into. Close-quarters work where a bayonet or a knife often mattered more than anything a Marine could actually fire. Survivors of that campaign and others like it across Peleliu, Tarawa, and Okinawa consistently describe the knife not as a weapon of last resort, but as genuinely standard equipment, carried alongside a rifle rather than instead of one, used for exactly the mixture of combat and ordinary daily survival tasks. Its own hybrid fighting and utility design had actually been built around from the very first prototype. That reputation did not arrive through advertising or official Marine Corps messaging. It arrived through the accumulated word of thousands of individual Marines who had actually carried the same basic design through the worst fighting the Pacific War had to offer and lived to describe exactly why they trusted it. The knife continued in official and unofficial use through Korea and into Vietnam. Official issue gradually tapering across those later decades, even as the design's own reputation among the men who had actually carried it only grew stronger with each passing conflict. Veterans mustering out after each successive war frequently kept their own personal knives rather than turning them back in, a working tool useful enough in civilian life for hunting, camping, or simple everyday utility that thousands simply never gave theirs up, regardless of whether military regulations technically required it. The Marine Corps' current standard issue bayonet, the OKC-3S, is a considerably more modern design built around synthetic materials and a different blade geometry entirely, but its visible lineage runs directly back to the same 7-inch blade and stacked leather handle a Marine private on Guadalcanal once reached for instead of his rifle, a design language that has never actually disappeared from Marine Corps equipment, even as the specific product carrying it has evolved. Camillus was never the only company actually building the knife during the war, a detail easily lost given how thoroughly the Ka-Bar nickname eventually attached itself to the design regardless of manufacturer. Union Cutlery, Robeson Cutlery, and Pal Cutlery all held wartime contracts alongside Camillus, each producing knives to the same official military specification, but with small, genuine variations in finish, marking placement, and material sourcing that reflected each individual factory's own production methods and available supply chains under the general pressure of total wartime manufacturing. A Marine issued a knife stamped with one company's name had no particular reason to think his own example was in any way different from a buddy's example stamped with another, since the underlying design specification remained identical across every contracted manufacturer. But those small production differences are precisely what collectors today spend years learning to distinguish, treating each manufacturer's own specific production run as its own distinct chapter within the same larger wartime story. Original wartime examples carrying genuine documented provenance, particularly knives that can actually be traced to a specific unit or a specific campaign through surviving paperwork, now command prices among serious collectors that would have genuinely astonished the quartermasters who once ordered them built for a few dollars apiece under wartime contract. Distinguishing an authentic 1942 through 1945 production example from a later commemorative or reproduction requires genuine expertise, since manufacturing marks shifted position on the blade at least once during the war itself, moving from the flat of the blade to the underside of the crossguard on knives produced during the war's later years, a small manufacturing detail that now serves collectors as one of the clearest ways to actually date a specific surviving example without relying on any paperwork that may or may not have survived alongside it. That same level of granular authentication interest, common among collectors of genuinely significant wartime equipment, reflects just how thoroughly the knife's own reputation has outlasted the specific war that first made it famous, an object serious collectors now study with the same rigor historians apply to the documented combat record itself. The Navy's own separately designated version of the same basic knife carried its own small but genuinely distinguishing detail worth knowing if you ever actually handle a wartime example yourself. Where Marine-issued knives shipped in traditional leather scabbards, Navy examples used a gray fiberglass sheath specifically marked USN rather than the leather variant, a material choice driven directly by the saltwater diving and shipboard utility role the Navy had actually adopted the knife for in the first place, since a leather sheath left in repeated contact with seawater tended to rot and disintegrate considerably faster than the same knife's own steel blade ever would under identical conditions. That single sheath material difference means a knife's own accompanying scabbard can sometimes tell a more precise story about its actual service branch than the blade's own markings alone, a small detail that matters enormously to the same collectors spending years learning to read every surviving physical clue a given example actually carries. What do you think actually built the legend here? The knife's own design, or the specific war that put it in a million hands at once? Leave your answer in the comments below.